Greetings. And welcome to the 2021 Global Water Futures Annual Open Science Meeting. My name is Philippe Cappellen, and I'm a professor at the University of Waterloo, and I'll be sharing this morning's opening and plenary sessions. So I'm speaking to you from my home in Kitchener, Ontario, and I would like therefore to start by acknowledging that my home and also the University of Waterloo are located on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee peoples. We're also situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised in 1784 to the Six Nations of the Grand River. So I would like to ask all of you to take a moment to acknowledge and reflect on the enduring role of Indigenous peoples as stewards of our shared land and water, and of particular relevance to the theme of this meeting, their role as essential partners in pursuing sustainable and equitable water futures for all Canadians. The Global Water Future Open Science Meeting will be entirely virtual this year. Nonetheless, despite the restrictions imposed on us by the pandemic, it is good to see that we're all still able to connect and come together. In fact, with actually close to 1,000 registered participants, this meeting will easily stand as the largest freshwater conference held in Canada thus far. The key objectives of our conference are, first of all, to share our latest scientific outcomes and achievements, also to connect with our numerous partners and stakeholders, as well as with the larger water community across Canada. And then finally, to facilitate networking and dialogue among these different groups. So the next 3 days will feature keynotes, parallel sessions, a meeting-long poster session, plus training, networking, and social events, including a virtual art gallery, water art gallery. All these events will be accessible to the meeting website, GWF2021.com. We will now move on to the official opening of our annual Open Science Meeting. And so I'm honored to welcome Elder Roland Duquette, who will open the meeting with a traditional ceremony. Elder Roland Duquette is a member of the Mistawasis First Nation and has lived in Saskatchewan for over 30 years. He is a traditional dancer and is fluent in his Cree language. Elder Duquette was placed in the residential school system from age 8 to 19 and has learned to cope and heal through sobriety, counseling, and his spirituality. Elder Duquette has a special gift of relating with youth, and he shares his teaching as an elder with many organizations in the prairies. Elder Duquette, please, the virtual floor is yours.
Hi, can I ask something? You tell me, I'm going to iwihin ko niya kagagi sumuyan kapiks ko an pitama taski na humuta. Nihio kaiti te sino uya te yochit askik. Yagomina nipik te yo choamit iwahotak. Tansi sa pachita tansamin isa pachitat ki ko pagitat. Baga mamoches kama mamtonetsakan kapata. Siski ko yo kapi uhte magagi. Kapi aimak npiga kapachitayak. Tahto kisagaw inot namak itio che kigo ipikskago yakasko. Asko inakskamak kigo muiki pastotiak. Usamik pagatik nipi. Maski yeminik takiano ikiochemigusiak. Kapachita kananto gaise aksia kitte weniti maga katis no te paegmananpi inotia pagwite sino etuegmana. Ego se emiasik kakwe nanto spaspita homanipi kagisagiti gotek waskitaskamik. Ego negigo ya kakwe stohtami poki te otanut askiho tagaya kawiki akuma. Kakwe wichito ya kakwe tap swasta ganig mamtonetsagan nawa. Yogamina iti kay kakwe moneta gan man pi aiwak. Good morning, everyone. I just want to reiterate my my Cree language as my base of my culture. I want to welcome you first of all to my Treaty 6 territory, homeland of the Métis, which in reference to the territory, we are a global protectors and stewards of the land here in the Treaty 6 territory. We hold sacred, first of all, to our waterways, our water source as our way of livelihood in many ways, that we can't lose sight of that. Already now we've been chipped away a little bit here and there, that we can access to some of the waters. So that's very distressing as an Aboriginal man. As an Indian man, I always call myself, because I'm from the old school, and a whole reference to that identity, to know that I was part of that growing up, how the waters were, how the water was treated, how the water diminished in different ways, claiming the land, claiming the resources by fencing, by rerouting water channels, waterways. Those are the effects that we have now, that we have to pay for the water wherever we go. And that wasn't in my day as how it was. I always maintained that, wherever I was walking, any long distance, I could access the water to drink. Now it's not happening. It's contaminated in some way or fenced in some way that I can't access water. It's just the way my walk was. Today, my walk is more to support with whatever influence I might have, but I don't use that as a means to dictate or to protest anything. I'm not in that way of letting people know, but it's through my prayers, my ceremonies, my adopting people that are in my talk, and in my belief system as well. So my spirituality is a big part, a big key into my way of knowing that that's the most sacred part of support is that for me, in my belief. And my identity as an Indian man, I hold strongly to that color of my skin and the color of the land. I am that. I am the land. I am the water I carry in myself. So the sacredness of that is what we try to protect with our little ones coming, the ones that haven't been born yet. So this is my message to everyone today, that we have to hold true to our way of commitment, to hold true to our beliefs, to hold true to the worldview, to hold true to the ways of how we have to establish that continual use, not to lose sight of that, or to make it a commodity, as the word says. We cannot use that. But yet it's a sharing thing, like we share people with each other. Our people coming from different worlds to live with us in our land, I know that we accept that, and we have to accept the water as our gift for them to use as well. So it's a very worldview that I hold strongly today. And my time with everyone here today, I welcome you all in a good way, in a very spiritual way as well, that our land is still, in effect of our ceremonies strong, but yet we have to keep walking. We have to keep that journey strong and the road solid, grounding. So that's my message today to everyone. The next 3 days, you are more than welcome, into our territory. And I thank you all for listening to me, and I thank you all for being here for us as well. this is what I leave you with, that in my heart. Hai muistas asamin na.
Thank you, Elder Duquette, for your welcoming, your teachings, and also pointing out the importance of sharing our water resources among different peoples, among different cultures. So it is definitely a very auspicious way of starting our conference. And I think you've set us on the path for positive sharing and discussions throughout the conference. So I really want to thank you on behalf of the entire GWF team on joining us today and providing this opening welcoming presentation. Okay, so we now have, as the second part of our official opening, we'll hear from representatives of the Global Water Futures universities and also from the Canada First Research Excellence Fund, or CFRF, program. And so to start off, I would like to call on Dr. Baljit Singh, who is the Vice President of Research at the University of Saskatchewan, to make his welcoming and opening remarks. Dr. Singh.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I also acknowledge that the University of Saskatchewan is located on the Treaty 6 territories of the First Nations and the homeland of the Métis. I'm so grateful to Elder Duquette for his remarks that connect what the water researchers are doing to something which is timeless. The water as a resource, water as something that sustains our life has always been here. Whenever there is a mission to any of the planets, the first thing that people look for, whether there is water at Mars, at Moon, or any such planet. So Elder Duquette's comments really are what this whole research program is all about, connecting it to our physical being and connecting us to our physical being and also at a very deeper spiritual level. I'm so delighted to be bringing greetings on behalf of University of Saskatchewan to this Global Water Futures Open Science Meeting, which has a tremendous program that you are going to be engaging in over the next 3 days. Of course, it builds on many years of the outstanding research work and the mentorship that the team has provided to young minds to create or educate the next leadership in water research. So I really commend all that. The program gets really outstanding leadership from my colleagues, Vice President Charmaine from University of Waterloo, Vice President Roland from Wilfrid Laurier, and Vice President Karen Mossman from McMaster University. It is through their dedicated leadership and the vision of my predecessor, Dr. Karen Chad, that we have this program, which is a truly national program, and it brings so much credibility and visibility to the excellent science that Canada contributes to the world. And also at this opportunity, I thank the Government of Canada for this major investment in the water research program, and Dr. Valérie Laflamme for her leadership and creativity in supporting these programs and also ensuring that these programs do deliver based on the original intent of the programs. So I'm truly appreciative of Dr. Laflamme as Associate Vice President at NSERC and the leader for these programs. Of course, the program has leadership from Dr. John Pomeroy and his team, and including Dr. Corinne Schuster-Wallace, that has led to this program, which is recognized as the top water program in the country and among the top 20 globally. So really, thank you, Dr. Pomeroy and your team of researchers from across the country for creating this tremendous program. And of course, you know, and you have said it, that one single 7-year program is not going to answer all the questions that we have in front of us when it comes to such a resource as water. Therefore, the thinking of the team and the leadership team is already looking forward to sustaining the program after the CFREF funding ends in the next couple of years. So I truly appreciate that forward-looking thinking that the leadership begins. Having been in this role as a vice president for more than 3 months now, and having had the opportunity to participate in the midterm review, I really want to comment on a couple of points. Number one is the way this program has true collaboration. And within that collaborative spirit, I want to highlight the effort that the group has made to partner with the indigenous communities and their leaders in a very respectful way. And that partnership is not that here we have the science, what is it can do for you, but really learning from the elders in the indigenous communities as to what does it mean to have water? How do we look at water? What happens if we do not have water? I think that very spiritual meaning of the water is something that the leadership has tried to learn from the indigenous leaders in Saskatchewan or in Ontario. And the second part, which I really commend, is going out and engaging the social science artistic piece. Very recently, the example of the virtual art gallery is something which is very commendable, very creative. Quite often we know that the science itself cannot answer all the questions we have in front of us. The leadership of the social sciences, the artistic expression, the humanities colleagues in leading the science is so critical in these times. And I really appreciate that the Global Waters Future has embarked on that particular piece. I remain optimistic that through your collaboration, your science, your leadership, your education, we are going to make some headway in finding answers to some of the most pressing questions around water. Through your work, we will end up lowering the temperatures in many conflict zones across the globe. I am perfectly familiar with those conflicts because I grew up in a land in northwest part of India where the water is a scarce resource, and also the conflict between the neighboring countries when it comes to distribution of the fresh waters flowing in from the Himalayas. And I know some of you are engaged in study of the water that comes down from those hills. So I'm very confident and very optimistic that your science will make a difference and have a global impact and shine even brighter light on Canada's ability to provide solutions to these complex problems that humanity faces. I wish you all the best, and may you all learn from one another and share what you know with each other and the world. Thank you so very much for this opportunity today to be in front of you, and always let me know if there's anything I can do to support this program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. This was very inspirational. Next, we will hear from Dr. Charmaine Dean, who is the Vice President of Research and International at University of Waterloo. Dr. Dean.
Thank you very much. I would also like to acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our university, the University of Waterloo, is situated on the Haldimand Tract. That's the land promised to the Six Nations. It includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this opening and to say a few remarks. You know, Dr. Singh talked about the particular context in the importance of this work, and I want to emphasize that we are seeing that, you know, water scarcity and water quality deterioration are really big challenges in Canada, and they are global challenges. The whole international research community has agreed that sustainable solutions to water issues and requires a lot of coordination. And this is difficult. It's difficult even in Canada, but also across countries. It's an overwhelming challenge to be able to bring folks together to understand how we can manage this valuable resource of our planet. The Global Water Future project, I think, has considerably strengthened water research, at least at our 4 Global Water Fork universities, and also through its international collaboration. So University of Saskatchewan, McMaster, Laurier, and University of Waterloo are really proud to be part of this community that's really trying to make change for the foreseeable future. It's also had a lot of collaboration between Canadian institutions more broadly and research institutes, and also with government and industry and municipalities and local communities. And that's so important given that this, water flows everywhere. The water that falls as rain here goes elsewhere as snow. We're all connected through this water connectivity. So the leadership of the Global Waters Futures Project in fostering this collaboration is so important. And in Canada, the growing collaboration with Indigenous communities is also helping to strengthen the community-based control over water resources. And that's going to be a key step in the road towards reconciliation. Thank you so much, Elder Duquette, for helping to set context for the opening here on how important this is. As you say, holding true to commitment, holding true to ways of sharing, holding true to watching for the next generation. That's embedded in the Global Waters Futures through the strengthened collaboration that we have with Indigenous communities who hold us to these commitments. The interdisciplinarity aspect is something that Vice President Singh mentioned, and it is really important for us. We have a Sustainable Futures initiative at the University of Waterloo that links in climate, water, energy, and it also links in key areas that are important. So Baljit Singh talked about environmental studies, applied health sciences, the arts, physical science, engineering, and mathematics, building from foundational research to policy and to decision making. And this is not just important for the work that the Institute is doing today, but it is also important, as I see it, in the training aspect. So we are working with many young people who are now becoming more savvy in interdisciplinary learning, in learning and knowledge related to Indigenous peoples. And as Elder Duquette says, this is so important for the next generation, not just, in my view, not just for water, but just this whole approach to how we solve a problem and how we work together. This is new learnings for our new researchers, and that's such a tremendous contribution as well for Global Waters Future. We also have a Water Institute at the University of Waterloo, and through our Water Institute, we are also a major player in co-designing science-based solutions for Canada and the world. And I would say that Global Water Futures, the collaborations that are created through the Global Water Futures project, that has been a tremendous foundation for our Water Institute and also support for some of the major activities. So I'd like to thank all of you who are working so hard on building this collaborating model on an approach to understanding water and the challenges of water and linking so tightly with our Indigenous communities. I know that this project is a lot of work, and I know that there's a lot of passion behind the project for many of you. So like Vice President Singh, I want to thank the leaders here and thank everyone who is participating on the project. And I want to wish you a very successful conference over the next little while, and also a tremendous success in the project as it moves forward. So Philippe, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll also lay my commitment like Vice President Singh has done. If there are ways that we can help you even further, please don't hesitate to bring them forward.
Thank you very much, Charmaine. and be certain we will call on you guys if necessary. So next, we're also extremely pleased that Dr. Valérie Laflamme, who is the Associate Vice President at the Tri-Agency Institutional Program Secretariat, is able to join us this morning and to provide a perspective from the CF5 program. Dr. Laflamme?
Thank you. Good morning. Bonjour, bonjour tout le monde. I live and work on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people and in the Ottawa region. And I first wanted to acknowledge that and indicate that I'm grateful for the opportunity to be present and to live in this territory. I would also like to thank you for the invitation to join you at the 2021 Global Water Futures Annual Open Science Meeting. In a perfect world, I would have been with you at the University of Saskatchewan, but I do appreciate the opportunity to come and virtually meet the group here and over the next days. So as indicated, I'm the Associate Vice President of the Tri-Agency Institutional Programs Secretariat that we also call the TIPS Secretariat. I would like to thank Philippe van Cappellen for his invitation and for the introductory remarks, and as well Elder Roland Duquette for your kind welcome and opening of this year's meeting. With your words on the importance of water, I think you've set the stage for real interesting discussions we'll have in the next days. I would also like to say hello to Baljit Singh and Charmaine with whom I've had the opportunity to interact virtually in the last weeks. As the Associate Vice President for the Tri-Agency Institutional Programs Secretariat, I'm responsible for managing a suite of 7 tri-agency programs that are funded by the federal government to act on the research ecosystem and to support the institutions in their work. So I manage a suite of 6 institutional programs, such as the CFREF program, and also the investigator-led research program called the New Frontiers in Research Fund. I'd like to point out that I'm joined by Dominique Lalonde today, who's the director for the institutional programs, and also one of the key people with whom we can be in contact if you have any questions about the CFREF program. So every year, the Secretariat is responsible for the administration of over $1 billion in post-secondary research. This is done with a very strong equity, diversity, and inclusion lens, and often requirements that are set within the design of the program, and also while keeping in mind the importance of the recognition and the responsibility that we have to ensure that the barriers that are set within the research ecosystem are removed to have access to our programs. And it's with that spirit that I'm very grateful and happy to see the work that is being done by this CFREF grant, which has a strong community-based orientation in working with Indigenous peoples and communities. So as many of you know, the University of Saskatchewan is unique in the country, as it's the only institution that has been awarded not 1, but 2 CFREF grants. So together with the investment from the investment of the CFREF program with the University of Saskatchewan accounts for more than $115 million. The CFREF program, more generally, the goal is to support the institutions like the University of Saskatchewan so that they can become global research leaders. In this case, in the field of global water futures, where you aim to bring forward water solutions to the water threats in an era of global change. And this is done in this specific case for this project in collaboration with Indigenous communities, as was already indicated and will be shown in the next days, and also with the University of Waterloo, Wilfrid Laurier University, and McMaster University. So over the course of the two competitions where CFREF grants were funded, the Government of Canada has invested $1.2 billion over 17 institutions. These investments are made jointly by the granting agencies, which I'll call, to be quick, CIHR, NSERC, and SSHRC, and also with additional investment made by the Canada Foundation for Innovation. So in the last weeks and months, TIPS has been in the process of conducting midterm reviews for all CFREF grants. That is quite an important step within this program, given the significance of the investment that is made within the research institutions. We've completed the site visits that were, of course, virtual given the context of the pandemic. And I'd like to thank the team at University of Saskatchewan for their collaboration in making this exercise, although virtual, very beneficial. We've clearly felt that we were very welcome, might it be virtually, from the researchers, administrators, and collaborators, and also the students and the postdoctoral researchers with whom we've met. It's through these virtual midterms assessment meetings that I've had the opportunity and pleasure to see Dr. Baljit Singh and Dr. Charmaine. What we've learned from these site visits will be used in the context of the preparation of the next CFREF competition, and will also be used to make sure that we as a Secretariat continue to adequately support the institution in reaching their objectives for this program. So, c'est avec un véritable plaisir de me retrouver aujourd'hui avec vous. I'd like to wish you the best success in the continuation of this meeting. Thank you very much. Merci.
Je vous remercie au nom de toute l'équipe GWF. Comme on dirait, GWF. So this concludes then this opening ceremony of the 2021 Global Water Futures Annual Open Science Meeting. And again, a very, very, very warm thank you to Elder Duquette, Dr. Singh, Dr. Dean, and Dr. Laflamme. And so the first plenary session is now about to start. Okay, so this is the first morning plenary session. And if you're just joining us, welcome to the Global Water Future 2021 Annual Open Science Meeting. And as already mentioned earlier this morning, this is of course an entirely virtual meeting given the condition or the pandemic in which we have to live through. We have a very exciting program lined up for the next 3 days. And please visit the GWF2021.com website for all details. Before we start, a few housekeeping items. First of all, as you will see during the plenary talks, but also during the parallel sessions, there will be a Q&A box on your screen. And please enter your questions through the Q&A box. There's also closed captioning available. You will have to click then on a CC button to get that started. Also note that the plenaries, the panel sessions, and the panel discussions will all be recorded and will therefore be available afterwards for viewing. And please engage with us on social media using the hashtag GWF2021 handle. Next, please, I would like you to take some time to read through the Global Water Futures Annual Science Meeting Code of Conduct, which you can also find on the meeting webpage. And the Code of Conduct is really designed to promote meaningful scientific debate grounded in respect for one another. All right, so I'd like to now to start with introducing a person that probably needs very little introduction, namely Dr. John Pomeroy, who is the director of the Global Water Futures Program. Dr. Pomeroy is a distinguished professor in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Saskatchewan. He's also the Canada Research Chair in Water Resources and Climate Change. And he's also the director of the University of Saskatchewan Cold Water Laboratory in Canmore, Alberta. Dr. Pomeroy has kindly agreed to give us an update of the many achievements of the Global Water Futures program. And therefore, John, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Philippe. And I want to thank you for your chairing of the local program committee and the chairing of this introductory session. So I will start and share some slides with you. I would like to note I'm speaking from Treaty 7 territory, where the Stoney Nation and the Kootenai have traditional homes in the Canadian Rockies, from a field laboratory out here. And so I'm going to talk about the status, prospects, and some of the grand challenges that we see looking forward. And I want to recognize my co-author on this presentation, Professor Corin Schuster-Wallace, who's Associate Director of GWF. So the first thing is Canada's water crisis. This is always hanging over Global Water Futures. This was the motivation for developing the Global Water Futures program, and it is not an easy crisis to help solve, and I think is really a lifetime mission for most of us in the program. We look across the country, and despite the perception that Canada is a water-rich and water-fortunate country, we have water crises all over the place. Historical droughts and floods, wildfires, deglaciation, permafrost loss, frozen ground changes, water contamination, toxic algae blooms on our Great Lakes and other lakes. And then the continuing problems of water quality for our rural communities, and especially our Indigenous communities across the country, which are a national scandal. So we're the only G7 country that has not had a flood forecasting system. And yet our flood damages have gone up by an order of magnitude since the previous century. So we are in the midst of a water crisis, and as is the rest of the world, and that is why Global Water Futures is a very timely program. We were delighted when the Canada First Research Excellence Fund funded this program. It's a rather different one in that it's a partnership amongst principally 4 universities, Saskatchewan, Waterloo, McMaster, and Laurier, but 14 other universities and groupings across the country, from coast to coast and even to the north with Yukon University. So it's a very broad program, and that's what's necessary to address a very broad water crisis. The aims of Global Water Futures from the beginning and remain to place Canada as a global leader in water science for cold regions, and but we hope to be a global leader in water science in general, and I think we're headed in that direction, and to address the strategic needs of the Canadian economy in adapting to change and managing the risks of uncertain water futures and extreme events that are plaguing our country right now. Within that, we have a tripartite mission. One is to improve disaster warning. I mentioned the lack of a flood forecast system, but for instance, right now, we're in an extraordinary drought over parts of the southern prairies, and that drought extends in a more moderated form from Vancouver Island to the Maritimes. And so droughts, water quality events, all these things we want to be able to predict much better. To predict water futures in the long term, to be able to say how much water Canada will have available by the end of the century, what will its quality be, how might we manage it, how might we better manage it, and how will we ensure equity for our communities across the country. And then to work with users to help them adapt to changes driven by climate change, driven by development, driven by changes in their economy and society. And risk management. Risk management is the water game. The climate change risk is manifest as a water risk. And this is what Canadians are seeing more and more. We're seeing this in our insurance, our home insurance bills. It affects the economic viability of the country, as well as how we manage our ecosystems. And so we're managing risk with predictive uncertainty at the core of that in our mission. Global Water Futures is built around 3 science pillars. The pillar 1, the foundational pillar, is the science that allows us to diagnose and predict change in cold regions. That's where the science and the physical, biological, social science and policy aspects of the program sit. And then we have a very operational pillar, developing data and decision support systems, the modeling systems, the data management systems that underpin our research. And the third one, where the rubber hits the road, as our founder, Howard Weeder, used to say, designing user solutions. So solutions to user-posed questions, working with users. So the idea is that this is transdisciplinary research. We're outside of the ivory tower, working with communities, with sectors, with governments across Canada and around the world to find water solutions to help them move forward. And that stands out quite a bit. The program, as a result of that transdisciplinary approach, has grown massively. One is that we've taken the $77.8 million award from CFREF and increased this to a $300 million budget through in-kind historical data sets, through cash and formal in-kind contributions from our partner universities and our users, and then to adding on tri-agency, CFI, and other federal funding to this pot. And so that's allowed a tremendous expansion of the program. We now have funded 18 Canadian universities. 189 faculty members at these universities are funded investigators. They have brought in 478 partners from across the country and have hired almost 1,000 researchers, graduate students, undergraduate students, postdoctoral fellows, research associates, technicians, fellows, other scientists. And this group has not let any moss grow on it. They have established 60 observatories, water observatories across the country to conduct experiments. And these can range from an instrumented glacier in the high mountains to instrumented Great Lake to an Indigenous community that is being observed by its own people and residents. And then publications, over 790 publications now, 1,850 presentations, 3,200 media stories. Now, this is how we were pre-pandemic. This is the measurement of global water futures last spring at this time. So imagine where we might be now, and we'll find out later this summer as we compile the new results. We work with United Nations programs around the world, UNESCO, the International Hydrology Program, the World Meteorological Organization, the World Climate Research Program. We're one of only 3 global hydroclimate projects in the world, and Future Earth, where we have a substantial role. So we're tied in internationally as well. The Pillar 1 and 2 projects of the 64, there are 21 of these that are approved. I'm not going to rattle them all off, but you can take a look at them and get the idea of the breadth of the foundational science and modeling and data programs that sustain global water futures. Everything from looking at lakes to the high mountains, to the north, to the wetlands, to communities, to toxic emissions, on and on and on. Groundwater, it's all in there. And absolutely wonderful science coming out of this. The Pillar 3 projects, we have 12 large Pillar 3 projects that were regionally based or sectorally based around the country. So dealing with the boreal forests, or the prairies, or the Great Lakes, or the north, or the mountains, but then dealing with sectors such as agriculture, or aspects such as water quality, extremes in climate, using eDNA, looking at modeling from the natural system to humans across. All of this is in there, along with our unfortunately greener and greener lakes. We've also instituted a very specific and deliberate Indigenous community water research strategy. This was developed with Indigenous communities based upon meetings that started at 6 Nations in Southern Ontario and carried on to Waniskewan, and smaller meetings in the North, in the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, in Saskatchewan and elsewhere. And these have resulted not only in continuous engagement with Indigenous nations and their governments, but a set of Indigenous community water research projects. And so these are formally Pillar 3 projects, but they're different because they were co-developed and co-led with Indigenous communities and ranged from Southern Ontario to Northern Ontario to the prairies to the far north. And so those couple Indigenous knowledge and science in unique ways that can make tremendous advances. Our core teams in Global Water Futures, vast numbers of people funded to make sure the program is functioning. This is outside of the projects. And we bring all these core teams together in a coupled strategy, but I wanted to show you some of the observatories first to get an idea of what those 60 observatories might look like. And there are all sorts of things, but tremendous instrumentation and observations and engagement occurring across the country. And then we couple it all together. We bring the core water observations, data prediction, and knowledge mobilization together in a unique way that is now being used and copied in a sense by the World Meteorological Organization and the World Climate Research Program as a way forward. And so that innovation has been useful around the world, we think. Modeling over 5 million square kilometers, which is bigger than the European Union. And so a massive task, of course. The Planetary Water Prediction Initiative, Dr. Singh mentioned our efforts in the Himalayas, the upper reaches of the Ganges, where we're starting, also in Central Asia, in the Andes, in South America, in the Pyrenees, and across North America, tied into many programs. I won't list them all, but there are MOUs with many of these, and developing ones with Nepal right now. And so we have people working on problems globally in conjunction with guidance from those UN organizations. GWF has had tremendous impact on our institutional research capacity. At the University of Saskatchewan, we've had 7 new faculty hires. We have a smart water systems lab, an airborne cold regions observatory, ultra high resolution mass spec lab, the ability to extract eDNA. This has been fantastic stuff. The cold water lab in the Rockies. Wilfrid Laurier University at 5 hires, a massive changing Arctic network and lab and warehouse space throughout the Northwest Territories. You can go into Yellowknife and you can find Wilfrid Laurier University now, which is really spectacular. University of Waterloo with 5 new faculty hires, tremendous new labs, the Water Institute facilities, environmental particle analysis, and a sampling network in the Greater Toronto area. All these are done with local collaborations. And McMaster University, 2 hires and more coming, stronger ties and investments with 6 nations of the Grand River, upgrades to Turkey Point, and a Whitehorse office. So you can go into Whitehorse, Yukon, and find McMaster University. So our universities have truly not just expanded in capacity, but expanded in locations because of Global Water Futures. If we look at equity, diversity, inclusion by the numbers, and compare Global Water Futures, these are from surveys that are 2 years ago, so we will get updated information coming soon. But Global Water Futures is ahead of the general 18 projects in CFREF in some of the EDI objectives, except for disability. But in fact, we know that we have many more Indigenous people than have indicated on their survey, and this is before our 6 new Indigenous community-led projects we're going. But our targets are not where we want them yet. If we look at the Canada Research Chair targets, those are generally accepted ones that we should be looking at for equity deserving groups. And we have ways to go to get to those, but we are working hard on that. And one thing we have done is to hire Dr. Andrea Rowe as our EDI specialist and advisor. And with her help and the work of many more, Corinne Schuster-Wallace and others, we have worked to develop strategies that can improve EDI across the country. One, we learned a lot from Dr. Sherry Westbrook's Create for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan, but in conjunction with the other universities in the program. Our young professionals have taught us much. And through the Women in Water lecture series and our distinguished lecture series, we are bringing some of the top women researchers to speak, and also in the Women in Water series to discuss about the challenges of being a woman in science. And so these are important, but we have also a strategy for change. And so our equity, diversity, inclusion strategy is an intersectoral approach in a large research network. It's a This is a massive challenge to look at, and we want to transform our institutions and our way of doing things, and doing this by example, but doing this through leadership as well, and how we better work together, how we can have global impact, and how our partnerships can help us with these things. And water is a particularly unifying substance to work around, and one that in many traditional societies, women are the water keepers. And so in terms of some of the equity aspects, it can be perhaps the medium around which we make advances. In communications, GWF has had 52 news releases, 3,200 stories, 34.5 million readers of these stories, over 1 million impressions on Twitter, over 100,000 website views, dozens of events, thousands of video views. So our communications team from the 4 universities has done a superb job there. We've tried to communicate through art, knowing that not everybody wants to see a graph and listen to numbers rattled off a chart. And art can be a way to communicate complex and difficult science in a unique way. We started with the artist in residence, Gennady Ivanov, from Norwich, UK, on the Transitions project in collaboration with Professor Trevor Davies at the University of East Anglia, and have expanded to the virtual water gallery, which was developed by Dr. Louise Arnau, a postdoc, and has produced art from dozens of artists across the country. And you see from the men who paint a representation of the Saskatchewan River Basin above. So these are exciting things that bring it forward. We've had great national initiatives with Environment Canada on the flood forecasting strategy, water prediction, with NRCan on a whole variety of topics, and floodplain mapping on climate change, groundwater work, national water predictions observatories in 8 river basins, and these are often collaborative. And we have encouraged and propose and advise the federal government to move forward on a Canada Water Agency, which was announced in the speech from the throne and in the budget just last month. So it is moving forward. We've had confirmation of that, and we look forward to working with the federal government in its development. It's very much a implementation of some Global Water Futures concepts, we hope. Internationally, we have a number of major initiatives that I've mentioned before that we're tied into. Principal new one is the UN Water Action Decade, and we set up the Canada Water Decade site with UN University. But we have agreements with the UK Water Security Alliance, with NCAR in the United States. We have our planetary water prediction program I'll talk about in a bit, agreements with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and our transition work with the Russian Academy of Sciences. So we are tied in very strongly around the world. Some grand challenges for Global Water Futures coming forward are water solutions. We need to continue to carry on with water solutions for user-posed questions on aspects of food security, energy security, infrastructure, economic development, safe communities, conserving our ecosystems, and better water governance. We need to, of course, to solve these problems, we need improved scientific foundations that we're working on, and we have to improve our community engagement and knowledge mobilization to co-develop these solutions, such as we are with Indigenous communities. We want to continue to contribute to a national water forecasting and prediction system. We want it to be the best in the world. We want to continue to contribute to decolonization of Indigenous water management in Canada. Indigenous communities and people need to be at the table when water decisions are made as part of improved river basin management across Canada. And we want to contribute to water futures, peace and security around the world through science and our predictions. In Canada, we want to take science and traditional knowledge to inform a revitalized water strategy for Canada. We'd like to see a new Canada Water Act, and we'd like to see that Canada Water Agency develop quickly and fully to become a powerful force. Finally, we see global water solutions for Canada and the world as a way forward to lead to water sustainability and to meet some of those UN Sustainable Development Goals in a time of rapid climate change and human development. And we think that the water and related climate crisis will be seen as far worse than the pandemic that we're dealing with now. I'd like to wrap up by thanking the organizers of this conference. This was originally planned to be at the University of Waterloo and Wilfrid Laurier University in person, and hence we have a local program committee from there. Philippe van Cappellen, but Harriet Bigas has worked so hard on every aspect of it, as have many of the others. And then a vast number of the Secretariat core team and other organizers are keeping things moving behind the scenes. We thank you all. And then our young professionals are hosting events, and our virtual water gallery is hosting an event. So thank you. And a special thank you to Roland Duquette, to our VP Research, and to the Associate VP of the TIPS for a welcome. And off we go. Have a great time at this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, John, particularly for this very insightful update, and which again highlights the very broad range of activities, advances, but also impacts that the Global Water Future Program is having and will continue to have. So we didn't plan for a Q&A period after John's presentation, but of course, John will be with us for the next 3 days. So feel free to engage with him on further discussing what GWF means for Canada, for the world, and also how you can maybe engage further with the Global Water Futures Program. So thank you very much. So it's now my pleasure to invite our first keynote speaker of the meeting, Dr. Elena Bennett. Dr. Bennett is a professor and Canada Research Chair in Sustainability Science at McGill University. Her work focuses on the interactions among ecosystem services and how we can manage these services to design more multifunctional working landscapes. She was a leader of the Montérégie Connection project that worked with stakeholders to understand the role of landscape connectivity in the provision of a dozen ecosystem services and how these might change across a range of future scenarios. She's now leading the ResNet, a large NSERC strategic network that builds on the Montérégie Connection to compare ecosystem services provision in 6 exemplar working landscapes across Canada. Her most recent work focuses on using radical transformative experiments in society as seeds to improve storytelling and sense-making about how we might achieve a quote-unquote good Anthropocene. So Dr. Bennett's talk today is entitled Another 10,000 Years of Agriculture and Water. And so we're eagerly looking forward to her talk and to the context it may provide for a lot of the research that is being done across GWF. Now, just a remark for the audience, remember to ask your questions in the Q&A box. We will be collecting these for the discussion time following Elena's talk. Note also that you can vote for your favorite questions and see in real time which questions are most popular. We'll, of course, be taking note of those, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So, Dr. Bennett, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Great, thanks so much for that introduction and for catching that I made a last-minute change to my title there. I appreciate it. And yeah, looking forward to the conversation and the discussion. It's already been really interesting for me just sitting in on the morning so far. So I am speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, which is the Mohawk Nation, which is part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And I'm going to try to take a very, very long-term perspective. I'm mostly a scientist working on sustainability of agricultural systems. So I'll use the link between agriculture and water to set some examples for the things that I'm going to talk about, but taking this very long-term view. And the reason I take that long-term view is just sort of looking at things and saying, okay, well, we've had agriculture on the planet for 10,000 years, since the start of the Holocene, when temperatures on the planet became more stable than they had been in the past. We've had agriculture. And so what does it mean to keep agriculture around for the next 10,000 years? And you've just heard about some of the changes that our planet is currently facing with climate change and change to water systems. And so I find it very interesting to think about this very long-term view, not just thinking about the next 5 or 10 or even 100 years, but to really think out into the future. And that kind of thinking is traditionally really hard. So to get a sense of the magnitude of the challenge of thinking about 10,000 years, let's just talk about the last 1,000 years in North America. So if you were standing in North America in the Middle Ages, so around year 1000, about 1,000 years ago, in the area outside of St. Louis, you might have seen something that looked like this. This is Cahokia, which was a large Native American city from that time period. And so imagine trying to, walk down and talk to these folks about what life looks like in this place in St. Louis today. That's a really, really difficult kind of task that we take for ourselves. But I think it's a really important task because we're seeing these changes coming at us, and we don't want to just respond in a way that helps us to keep systems around and protect our water systems for the next decade. We really want those to be here in perpetuity. So the St. Louis of today, that would be the picture that you're trying to explain. So let me start by doing a little bit of a dive into why I'm going to talk about agriculture at a meeting about water and the future of water, and why we might anticipate a problem with keeping agriculture around for the next 10,000 years. And I like to do that by thinking about the planetary boundaries. So these, of course, were originally set out by UN Rockstrom, then quantified by a team led by Will Steffen. And these are 9 boundaries beyond which we believe that there are significant thresholds for the Earth system. So when you pass this orange circle zone of high risk, as you can see that we've done for biogeochemical flows of phosphorus and nitrogen, for extinctions per million species per year, and we're on our way there for other things like land system change. When we pass those, we believe that there are thresholds that significantly change the way those systems work. And so one of the issues, and this is work that was led by Bruce Campbell, was looking at, well, what's the role of different types of land use in our passing of these boundaries? And so here we've just put these black dots on the planetary boundaries to show the role of agriculture. And so the one that I'm going to now spend a bit of time talking about is this one here, this phosphorus boundary, which you can see has quite a considerable contribution of agriculture, and that's through our use of phosphorus and nitrogen fertilizers to help grow agricultural products. That fertilizer, and I'm going to stick mostly to phosphorus, of course, doesn't stay on the agricultural fields where we put it. It runs off, it gets into our water systems where it can be a significant cause of freshwater eutrophication. So agriculture has a pretty important role in the planetary boundary for phosphorus. We know that agricultural practices have increased the rate of introduction to the phosphorus cycle. So just simply digging phosphorus up out of the ground, mining it, and using it in fertilizers has about tripled the rate at which phosphorus is cycling through the system. I mentioned that leads to eutrophication, primarily of freshwater and estuarine systems, and can lead to anoxic events that are problematic for a bunch of different reasons for people and other species. And agriculture is the biggest source of human impact on that phosphorus cycle, and the key to our proximity or even crossing of that phosphorus boundary. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we know about that phosphorus boundary, and what are some things that we don't know, especially about spatial heterogeneity. So I'll start just by talking about how we quantified the phosphorus boundary. So in the original planetary boundaries work, we had quantified that phosphorus boundary for ocean systems. So we basically compared the inflow to the oceans to natural background rates, and set a boundary at about 10 times the natural background weathering rate, or about 3 times the current rate. But with a limited understanding of how ecosystems were going to respond to that, and little understanding about the actual position of the boundary, even though we knew there was a high probability of a threshold. And so with a colleague, Steve Carpenter, and I decided we were really interested in updating that boundary for freshwater systems. What happens when we don't just set a boundary for anoxic events in the ocean, but set a boundary for trying to understand anoxic and eutrophic events in freshwater systems? So we recalculated boundaries for freshwater eutrophication, and I do mean boundaries. We set boundaries plural, in fact, 3 of them. And maybe I can explain it through this system here. So this is the diagram that we use to try to understand what's going on with the phosphorus system. So you can see that we have terrestrial ecosystems and freshwater ecosystems. The inputs to those terrestrial systems are mining and both human-induced and natural weathering. Those terrestrial systems then leak some phosphorus to surface freshwater systems, which then leak it to marine systems. There's a small amount of phosphorus dust in the air, but it's almost negligible. And then some phosphorus that gets retained in freshwater sediment. And so what we wanted to do was calculate the input of phosphorus to 3 different places. We wanted to calculate the input to freshwater systems. We wanted to calculate the input to overall terrestrial soil. And we wanted to calculate just the mass of phosphorus stored in soil, which is, of course, increasing over time as we accelerate that phosphorus cycle. And for each boundary, you should know that we calculated 2 water quality targets. So one at 24 milligrams phosphorus per cubic meter. That's a typical target for lakes and reservoirs. And then we calculated a target of 160 milligrams of phosphorus per cubic meter. That's about the pre-industrial phosphorus concentration in rivers. So in other words, we wanted to have a river target, which is somewhat larger, and a lake target, which is somewhat smaller. And then finally, we calculated these for 3 different estimates of phosphorus flow to the sea, because that's a just highly variable number in the literature. So it could be as low as 9 teragrams per year, and it could be as high as 32. So let me just take a quick look at those results. So I'll talk you through what you're looking at. So this is the input to freshwater on the top, the input to soil in the middle, and the input or the amount stored in the soil at the bottom. Then you've got white, gray, and black. Those represent the low, medium, and high input to sea values. And then for each of those, you see 3 different bars. That's for the 24 milligram target, the 160 milligram per cubic meter target, and then what we know about the current rate. And so the key message from this is that that current bar is bigger than any boundary that we might set for any input to the sea, for any target, and for any of the variables that we're interested in. In other words, no matter how we looked at this, if we're thinking about eutrophication of freshwater systems, we have passed a significant terrestrial boundary for phosphorus. Another way to look at that is this idea of just changing the global phosphorus cycle. So we've taken here just an image of phosphorus moving from rocks into freshwater systems, a system that would ordinarily cycle in thousands to millions of years, and made it into one that on the reverse side is now cycling in decades, with significant impact on our freshwater systems. We take a couple more looks at what this means. So we've also then looked at those boundaries spatially. This is work that was done by Graham McDonald quite a while ago now, when he was a PhD student in my lab. He's now professor at McGill. And what he did was calculate with a 5-degree resolution for 123 crops globally. I believe the data was for the year 2000, looking at inputs and outputs of phosphorus into agricultural systems, where the inputs are fertilizers and manure uses, and the removals are harvested crops. And so we have, if we look at that globally, we have quite a bit more fertilizer and manure being applied than is harvested. So about 14 teragrams of phosphorus per year is applied in fertilizers, another almost 10 teragrams per year applied in manures, and the removals are a little less than 12.5 teragrams per year. But what you can see here is that there's massive variation in the magnitudes of those imbalances, where we have surpluses in red and yellows, and deficits in blues and greens. And we get both surpluses and deficits around the planet. So some of the key surplus areas, either in intensive croplands or some intensive livestock areas, especially where those livestock are kept in feedlots, as well as some key deficit areas. Those happen sometimes in places with a lot of livestock, but that are on the land. And in fact, those deficits cover quite a bit of the global cropland area. About 30% of all global cropland area is actually in deficit. Okay, and if we just look at what those imbalances look like, so here what you're seeing is still in blue the deficits, and in red the surpluses, and just looking at how the distribution of those quartiles, so the fourth quartile being the highest, either surplus in red or deficit in blue, how those are distributed around the world. And you can see that there's surpluses and deficits in every continent. Some continents like Europe maybe have a little bit more deficit than surplus. Others like North America, where we are, have quite a bit more surplus than deficit. Okay, if we think about the contribution, then I alluded to this a little bit, of food crop versus feed crop versus livestock to those phosphorus flows. I'll just draw your attention down here to these two graphs at the bottom, where we looked at how much fertilizer was applied relative to how much crop was harvested. This was done over time from the 1960s to the mid 2000s, 2007. And the thing to note here is that for the countries, the dozen countries that we were able to look at, the crop production efficiency was about 66%, whereas the livestock production efficiency is really only about 8%. And what's going on with the residual phosphorus there is lost to surrounding environment, primarily water systems, or accumulation in soils, which is really just about loss that's coming down the pike in the future. Yeah, I think I won't say much more about that example. So we can think about some of the potential solutions to this, and one way to think about that is to reduce the fertilizer use across locations with really intense fertilizer driven surpluses. So we can look here at the top quartile surpluses, so still drawing on Graham McDonald's work, and which of those are locations where fertilizer is the driver, and can we then reduce fertilizer use in those areas, either redistribute it to areas that have phosphorus deficits, and if we were able to do that, we might be able to not only cope with some of those deficit areas, but also increase some of the or reduce rather some of the areas where we have these massive surpluses. So a group of us then led by Jen Metzen did some work looking at what this would look like in detail. So here we looked at corn phosphorus demand just in the United States in gigograms. You can really see that corn belt in Iowa showing up there where the phosphorus demand for corn is greatest. And then laid over top of that, a look at where there are sources of potentially recyclable phosphorus. So this is primarily manures that could be recycled, and then just compared those two maps. And so when you compare those, you find that this isn't such an unreasonable solution. So only about 37% of the potential recyclable phosphorus is required to meet all the phosphorus demand from US corn that's harvested annually. And about 3/4 of that can be met within the same county. So we don't have to move phosphorus outside of a county 75% of the time to meet all of our phosphorus demand needs. You can imagine the reduction that we'd be able to have in imported fertilizers if we were doing that. And even the surplus outside of that, so that remaining 25%, really only travels on average about 300 kilometers to meet the biggest demand. So if we think about meeting demand in that corn belt, you might need to move phosphorus as far as 300 kilometers. So that's, to me, is actually surprisingly short distances, and really remarkable that we could meet demand primarily within a county. Okay, so I'm going to veer off of some of the problems to thinking a little bit more about solutions, and the kinds of solutions that I was just talking about. These ones that are neat and cool, and I think have some fun science to back them up, generally fit into what I would call sustainable intensification. So it's not just increasing efficiency relative to dollar input, which would be intensification, but increasing it relative to environmental inputs or environmental costs as well. So it's about optimizing crop production while taking into account a variety of different sustainability considerations. So increasing productivity, decreasing our economic cost, decreasing our environmental cost. You may have heard of more crop per drop, increasing yield per unit input, less greenhouse gas per unit product. Those are all different ways that we talk about that. And a lot of people in agriculture suggest that we can get to a more sustainable agriculture by taking on these kinds of solutions. And in many cases we can, but I want to point out that when we're thinking about 10,000 years of agriculture, we need to also be thinking about the resilience of these systems. And we need to be careful that we're not reducing long-term agricultural resistance by making these systems so tightly constrained, by putting them in what some have called a state of coerced resilience, where we are holding the system in place through a variety of interventions. So where we tend to get into trouble and start to undermine resilience is when our solutions reduce diversity. We can see that when they reduce non-food ecosystem services, so the benefits that people get from nature. We know when we look out at agricultural landscapes, they are providing food, but they're also providing places to recreate. They give us a sense of place. They are maintaining clean water. When we start to see reductions in those other ecosystem services, we know we're starting to be in trouble. And when we whittle away safety buffers by aiming too close to the maximum. So we've been really good at increasing agricultural productivity with fertilizer and technology, but there is increasing evidence that increasing this sort of narrow sense of efficiency without addressing resilience is maybe causing damaging fluctuations in flood protection, for example, or in other environmental outcomes that we care about. So I would propose that this maybe requires that we start thinking about having entirely different definitions of what success and failure mean, that we need to be thinking about preserving key functions in the face of systemic change. And this is true for agriculture. I would be surprised if it wasn't also true for water systems more directly. And I would love to talk a little bit more about that at the end of this. So I have put forward that what this means, this developing a resilient agriculture, implies that we need to be thinking about persistence, adaptation, and transformation, that we need to be thinking about all three of these. So let me talk a little bit about what those mean, and then we can talk about how do you balance those? How do you know when to be persistent and when to be transformative? So persistent just means persisting in the face of inherent and expected shocks, and often means preserving, regulating ecosystem services and natural capital. So this is coping with things that we know are coming down the pike, like climate change or economic changes. It's absorbing shocks like price fluctuations or invasive species that tend to be a problem for farmers. Adaptive is about adjusting and allowing the system to adjust its responses to changing external drivers to allow the system to continue to develop along whatever its current trajectory is. So how can we make changes quickly without reducing the capacity of the system to support human well-being? Well, we do that by maintaining natural capital, social self-organization, and regulating systems. This is generally about slightly longer term change than persistence, like climate change driven increases in dry spell frequency, for example, without losing critical functions. And then finally, transformative, I would argue this is the one that we're probably least good at. If I can say that without saying that we're bad at it. This is how do we transform to new modes of operation, and especially how do we do that without damaging human or natural systems. So transformability, it's really the capacity to create entirely new kinds of development. So sometimes that sort of tinkering, squeezing in a little bit of more productivity doesn't lead us to a resilient agriculture. And in recent decades, maybe even more than decades, we've really avoided transformation in agriculture because it's pretty disruptive. It can incur short-term losses in ag productivity, problems for farming communities. And so one of the things that worries me is that with evidence that we're crossing planetary boundaries for phosphorus and nitrogen, for water and for climate, is that the time has probably come for transformation, but there's a big question about how we do this while protecting the people who such transformation will affect the most. Okay, so now we're to the part where I say things that are controversial, I guess. What I'm trying to get at here is that a marginally greener revolution is probably not going to lead to a resilient agriculture. So we know what it's not to have a resilient system. So financially profitable agriculture, but that undermines biodiversity or water systems, not resilient. Agriculture that produces food, but isn't economically viable for local communities, not resilient. Agriculture that causes any sort of long-term or widespread environmental crisis, not resilient, no matter how economically successful it is or how much food is produced. So the question here is how we search for systemic kinds of changes that enhance adaptive and transformative capacity while protecting the people who might be affected by that. And we need to do that we need to be thinking about what that resilient agriculture is going to look like. So when you sort of close your eyes and picture, agriculture 10,000 years from now, what does it look like? How do we meet the demand for agricultural products now and over the very long future? And how do we do that without fundamentally undermining the stability of the biotic systems that are essential not only for agricultural production, but for all kinds of other human needs? And I'll just point out that the way I'm framing that doesn't imply that production or consumption systems are going to remain in any sort of fixed configuration, or that we're going to continue any practice ad infinitum. So I'm really trying to explicitly allow for adaptation and for transformation. So to meet our fundamental needs without undermining the system. So this is about how we build a system that meets our needs, even as we face challenges that we might not even know about. We know that there's some challenges coming. We know we have major challenges in addressing issues between agriculture and water quality. But I think there's probably issues coming down the pike that we don't even know about at all. And to do that, we really have to be focusing on all the benefits that are provided by agricultural systems. So not just food, and not just food and economic security, but food, economic security, recreation, sense of place, water quality, all of these things that our agricultural landscapes are providing to us. And some of our recent thinking about how that works is trying to really connect the natural capital of agricultural systems to the quality of life of people in those agricultural landscapes and outside of them. So in this figure from a paper that we recently published in Advances in Ecological Research, you can see that we're imagining that management is really about thinking about the balance of natural capital and human inputs that we're going to use in a production system. So how much can I rely on good soil quality? How much do I need to amend that with fertilizers and manures? That then moves into an agricultural landscape that interacts with other landscapes through flows of water, through movement of animals. And that landscape then produces ecosystem services, and we get some bundle of different services. So we get some amount of food production, we get some amount of water quality, some recreation. And then those contribute then to human well-being, how happy we are, how healthy we are, how secure we are in our systems. And when I think about multiple ecosystem services or multiple benefits from agricultural systems, one of the things that worries me right now is how we are changing this system. And here's just some thoughts about that. So one of the things that we're doing is that especially through global corporations, are really changing this decision about balancing natural capital and human inputs and putting the emphasis very strongly on the human input side of that equation. Then the other key things are happening over here, and those are really about movement and trade and how we bring services from other ecosystems or other landscapes into our landscape to improve our quality of life. And that makes management of these systems much, much more complex. So here's another reason why we need experimentation. And this is really thinking about complex systems and systems where we don't have total control over the future. So down on the bottom, I'm showing you our image of the globe, and this ball is the Earth, or the state of the Earth system, and it's rolling across this surface, sort of staying to the lower areas, which are more stable. And it's being pulled by a variety of different drivers underneath here that sort of pull the surface and change what sort of system is more stable. And of course, the world isn't just one region. There are these regions interacting through trade, like I just mentioned. So if you look up at the top of this diagram, we might imagine 3 different regions that are going 3 different ways. And not only do those sort of add up to a global system, but they actually interact. So the path that region C takes changes what's possible for region B and region A and vice versa. So navigating those interconnections is super complex, and it's I think a major challenge for science and policy of all kinds, and one for which we really need better, more integrated measurements. And it was mentioned earlier this morning about water as a great integrator. And so, you know, how can water help serve here as an integrator that helps us think about the complexity of regional interactions? Okay, so I want to move from that into a little bit about how do we even just think about the future. And a lot of us, I think, hold a narrative in our heads about people and the environment, that people are generally bad. And the key to a better future is to somehow restrict or restrain people to ensure that we do the right thing. And what I want to shift into here is that I personally find that not to be necessarily true and not to be very useful. And so I want to introduce the idea that we can have a fabulous Anthropocene, epic, not era, but this is a piece of artwork, so I can't change it. But that we can think about the world that we want to live in and how to get to that world. So I would argue that a good Anthropocene is possible. And that we need to do some things to build that better future. And that's will make up this last little section of my talk here. So first of all, we need better visions so that we know what we're aiming for. You know, what is the agricultural system that I want? What is the water system that you want? To me, that has to be a system that shows people not as bad actors to be restrained, but as possible good actors who need to be encouraged and nudged in the right direction. We need to recognize and amplify and even multiply small efforts to make a better future. I will argue in the next few minutes that people are already out there doing a whole lot of things to make life better for themselves and their neighbors, and there's a lot of good lessons in those things to learn. And we need integrated metrics. So we need to be thinking about integrated complex systems and how we use these metrics to understand resilience of overall systems and their interconnectedness. Okay, so I'm going to think about stories. So the first thing that we need to do is develop better visions. Why visions? Why stories? Why change the narrative? Stories are just incredibly powerful. They don't even just explain the reality, they create it before our very eyes by helping to frame the way that we see the world and what it is that we see when we look out at the world. So I've been doing a lot of work lately about storytelling, and a lot of that has been through scenarios, which were, started off being used in the military, moved into corporations, and now have really taken over in the environmental world. These are just stories about the future with some sort of logical plot and narrative that governs the manner in which events unfold. And we can imagine different scenarios and we can compare them to one another. One of the issues that I see when I look out at the scientific community's efforts so far is, one, we tend towards negative futures. We're worried about problems, so we really like to think about stuff like this picture on the right. The other problem that I see is in this picture on the left, when we do work in the scientific community on positive futures, we often end up with these sort of, they're quasi poorly articulated. They're a little bit a utopian fantasy. They kind of overestimate conventional strategies to create real change, and they ignore some of the drivers that we see in the real world that are actually creating change. So in other words, I say the same drivers. We think about how people feel about the environment, the role of technology, what's happening with population or consumption. And it isn't that those aren't important. It's just that they're very well explored. We repeatedly develop scenarios where these relatively mild changes in how people feel about the environment or how they're using technology sort of massively transform the world. So I got really interested in whether we could build different kinds of scenarios that have more surprise in them, more transformation, more of the kinds of things that we see in the world around us and see in the history of how the world has developed. So if I think about my 10,000 years again and how hard it is to do that 10,000 year leap, I want to start by saying a better future is going to be pretty different from the world that we have today. It might have really different relationships between people and the environment. Our values might be different. Our cultures, our worldviews, even power and gender relations, relations between settler groups and First Nations communities, as we're starting to see change. These are the sorts of things that don't get explored in scenarios, but could be really different in a future better world. So, we don't know. Do we go from that to this? Do we go from this to that? What is this going to look like? It's going to look really different. So I have been proposing that we start by looking at things that people are already doing. What is out there in our communities that people are already doing to try to bring about change? And so when you look around, it turns out that there is a lot of new thinking and innovative projects that people are trying as they become aware of threats to society or threats to nature to try to create a better world, a more just, a more prosperous, a more ecologically diverse world, what I've been calling a good Anthropocene. And those things, we call them seeds. They're not widespread. They're not well known. They might be social. They might be technological, might be economic, tools, movements. But these are just little seeds that could grow into a better future or could help direct our attention towards the drivers that we might want to think about why things are working or what changes people want us to look at. So if I just give one example, this is an example from sort of far away, but this is the Health in Harmony project. They work in Indonesian Borneo, and what they've done is partner with local communities. They provide low cost or even free healthcare in exchange for commitments to reduce deforestation. Since they started working there in about 2007, there's been basically a 90% reduction in illegal logging households. The loss of primary forest has stabilized. They have about 20,000 hectares growing back. They've protected about 2,500 Bornean orangutans, and they get improved health in every metric of human health that they measure in these communities. And what I like about this is I would not have said, want to have better forests, improve people's health care. But Kinnari Webb and her team who led this project sort of figured out by listening to people that what was going on was they weren't cutting down forests to get rich. They were cutting down forests because their children were getting sick or their mother was ill and they needed the money for healthcare. So they made this connection and were able to have great effect through it. So we have collected about 500 examples of these seeds from around the world. We've built a database of them and we're studying them to try to understand, what makes them grow? How do they change people's values? Do they replicate? When do they scale? When do you see one grow that spreads and grows into other places around the world. So we're doing that kind of studying of them. And then we're also using them to develop scenarios. So we have this sort of novel scenario development process that mixes what you see here, which is these future wheels where we start with a seed and then kind of cycle our way out and imagine all of the impacts that it has, and then the impacts that those impacts have, and the impacts that those impacts have, and so on. We use those with a combination of seeds to imagine what sorts of futures a set of seeds might bring along, and then combine that with this pretty well-known 3 horizons framework to try to imagine pathways by which we can get from our current future to a future that we want, by having some things that need to go away, other things that need to grow or expand, and then a sort of controversial space in the middle. So we've been doing these scenario development workshops now from everywhere from Cambridge Bay to Johannesburg and all over North America and Europe, helping us to think about what some of the key drivers are, and finding some really interesting things about drivers, and finding some interesting things about storytelling. So I just love this quote about building a ship, that you don't start with collecting the wood and cutting the planks and assigning the work. You awaken people a longing for the wide and open sea. In other words, that storytelling, that vision of the future is what helps us see the potential that's out there, that makes people excited about creating these changes for a better world. So let me just come back around to agriculture, just to sort of see if I can wrap this sort of wide-ranging talk all together. Resilient agriculture, next 10,000 years, what is it that I would say that we really need to be focused on? So let me put 4 things out there, and then I'll end and we can have some conversation. So one is resisting a focus on single solutions to near-term problems. And I, for one, am really excited about some of the things that I've heard just this morning, or that I've read about the global water futures, and the effort to use water as a kind of integrating force to think not about single solutions, but about multi-solution space. So instead, move towards a diversity of solutions, and in particular ones that allow for adaptation and for transformation. We need to account for all the benefits of our agricultural systems, not just food, but to consider the important impact that our ag systems have on water systems, and on recreation, and on our sense of place. And then finally, just to allow space for dreams and visions and experimentation. 10,000 years is a really long time, and we want to be experimenting our way to that future, and doing the science to understand whether those steps are ones that are leading us in the direction we want to go or not. Okay, let me stop there and see how the question time is going to work. Should I maybe stop sharing my screen?
Elena, if you just have a few more slides, just go ahead.
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay. All right. So, well, then thank you so much for this very inspiring talk. I mean, it definitely provides us with new ways to think about sustainability, and also long-term sustainability, the linkages between water and food security, of course, and what it means to live on a finite planet with finite boundaries, and especially this need for vision and for boldness in our thinking about how to move forward. So I think we have a bunch of questions that came in, but I'll take the privilege of being the chair to ask my first question. That's something that's always been with me, having worked also on phosphorus, is this whole concept that was launched in the kind of the turn of the century, or even before that, about this peak phosphorus concept, the fact that ultimately we rely on rock phosphorus, and there's only a finite amount of it. Now, And clearly it was kind of a little bit debunked because people were putting it in terms of, oh, we're going to run out of phosphorus in 2010, and then it was going to be 2020, then 2030. But ultimately, on the very long term, on this 10,000 kind of time scale that you're thinking, don't you think that ultimately we're going to have to face this peak phosphorus, the fact that geology is ultimately going to put a limit on how much phosphorus we can extract to make fertilizers?
Yeah, so I'll just say first off that I think I need you around to summarize when I give a talk, because that was a fabulous summary of everything. But yeah, I worry about peak phosphorus a lot. I guess, you know, we get ourselves in a little bit of danger when we talk about peak something or claim that there's a particular year when we're going to run out, because economics usually gets in the way of that. You know, it becomes more expensive and then it becomes more profitable to think about other solutions. But, you know, the reality is there is a limited amount of phosphorus that we can dig out of mines. It's primarily in, you know, fewer than 5 countries. So it's a politically important issue too. I mean, the vast majority, something like 75% of it is in the Western Sahara part of Morocco, which has got its own political issues. So in the sort of 10,000 year view, this is a thing I worry about a lot. The one thing that gives me hope is, you know, when we see as fertilizers become more expensive and as people become more aware of the problem, I see things like, you know, development of struvite and ways to extract and pelletize the phosphorus that's in human waste that's coming through our sewage systems that would enable us to recycle it, or the slides that I showed early on about not needing to move animal manure farther than a county for the most part. It's like, oh, I was shocked by that result, because I just thought, well, we're not doing it because it's heavy and wet and expensive and you got to move it hundreds of kilometers. And then we did the analysis and it was like, no, actually, you don't have to go that far. So I hope that we will start to see these things and innovate, you know, find good solutions. But it is worrisome when you have something that is just, it is fundamentally limited and controlled by very few countries.
Yes. Well, and also we do move much worse stuff than manure through pipelines, so we can certainly do that. Okay, Harriet, we have questions, so go ahead.
Hi, yes, we do have questions. Actually touches upon something you just said, Elena, and also earlier in your talk. So trucking a large amount of manure, only 300 kilometers, would take a big toll on roads and energy use. How can the recycled nutrients be made more transportable?
Yeah, so I mean, there are people working on it. It's a great question. There are people working on it. And I should point out that the 300 kilometers was just to move the last 25% of the necessary phosphorus. So the first 75% comes from within a few miles, which still has a transportation, energy, carbon impact. But I know that there are very smart people out there working on, you know, how do we get some of the water out? The problem with manure is that it's just full of water, it's heavy. You know, so how can we turn that into something more like struvite, which is like a pelletized form of fertilizer to make it more movable? So, you know, that's the place to me where there's so much exciting science being done in all of these places to solve these sort of really particular questions.
Do you have another question, Harriet, from the audience? Go ahead.
Yes, we do. So this one is, why hasn't the economics of applying P regulated the use of P fertilizers better in areas that are already P rich?
Yeah, and so I will tell you what I think that I understand about this. It's a really good question, and it's one that every time I do field work on this, I'm asking my farmer friends, like, okay, so help me understand this. I'm measuring the phosphorus in your soil. I can see through my measurements that it's telling me you've got, you know, 3 times more phosphorus than you need. Why are you applying more? And what they generally tell me is a couple of things. So one, some of that phosphorus that they're adding is more available to plants than what is sort of remnant in the soil for over a long time. And so what that does is get their plants larger more quickly, which helps them get to market earlier, which is an economic benefit. And then the other issue is that phosphorus and phosphorus fertilizers have, for the most part, with a few exceptions, have remained cheap. It is relatively inexpensive insurance, basically, for a farmer who's, not making a whole lot of money on their product. They want to have, every last kilogram that they can get to bring to market. Why we haven't done better at developing, reinsurance or, other sorts of plans to say, hey, okay, farming community, I'd like you to use less phosphorus fertilizer. I will cover any margin between whatever it is, your highest productivity year and the current year, given certain weather conditions, to allow farmers to not put that fertilizer on, but still be financially covered. That just hasn't gotten into the policy realm as far as I know.
Okay, so also another question, and you probably can expect this by any talk nowadays. It's about COVID-19. I mean, the pandemic has really changed how many people in society understand and respond to environmental issues, to sustainability. Do you think there's a potential there to leverage the momentum to really advance efforts to live within these Earth's planetary boundaries, to recognize them? And how would we go about it? What's the role of universities, governments, communities, boundary organizations? So it's putting you a little bit on the spot here, but it's a question that really many people have.
Yeah, just a little question. It's I do think that there's potential. I think it's done a couple of things. One, I think that it has put just science in general in the public view a little bit more, and the value of science. So it sort of has increased that sense of scientists as being, whether you want to call it honest brokers or whatever you want to call it, as being there as, sources of information that can help us lead a better life. And I think that has been really good. I think, yeah, it has shown people, including us, right, that a lot of things that we would never have done before, like have virtual meetings and virtual talks over Zoom, that like, oh, that's possible. I wouldn't want to do it every year, but it's not so bad. We can reduce our own carbon footprint by a lot. So how do we, one of the big questions on my mind is how do you sort of keep that momentum going? And that I think is a big unknown. I will say, from that sort of seeds of a good Anthropocene perspective, I was really pleased and excited to see, even around my neighborhood, all of these things that just immediately popped up as the pandemic started. That was, oh, my neighbor is old and therefore much more at risk. I'm going to set up a system by which I can do grocery shopping for my elderly neighbors, or, all kinds of different things that people immediately stepped up to the plate to do those things. And so again, super exciting. I think there's a lot of potential there, but how do you know which are the most important things to keep in place? The experiments that worked really well, and then kind of get policies in there that help people keep those in place. I know at least in my faculty at McGill, one of the things that our dean has done is said, wow, this was amazing for our carbon budget to not have everybody flying around. And she changed the way our annual review process goes so that we sort of get extra kudos for anything that we do that is online. So that's a way that I think universities can say, here's one small thing that happened in a university, people flew less. I can do this thing to try to encourage more behavior in that direction. So I've been really happy to see that.
Okay, I think we have a couple more questions from the audience. Harriet, go ahead.
Yep, we have a few that came in. So this one is a little bit different. What's your perspective or opinion on aquaculture and aquaponics as hydroponics as alternative forms of agricultural production?
So I should start my answer by saying I am not an expert. So do not take this as the word of someone who knows. I mean, what I read is a lot of talk about, you know, aquaponics, hydroponics as potential, you know, solutions. You can make a closed system. Those things are all very interesting. What I worry about, but don't know that much about, but what I worry about is the energy required to run a lot of these systems. So my systems thinking brain says, okay, you're taking a system. Yes, it's outdoors and it's an open system and it's complicated for all kinds of reasons, but you're taking something that works on, you know, free natural sunlight, and often kind of moving that into an indoor system where you have to run the water, you have to run the fertilizer, you have to run the light, which can make it much more intensive. And I worry about that, although I'm sure that that's not the case for all aquaponics or hydroponics systems, but it's a thing I would keep my eye on for sure.
Okay, we have time for one last question. So Harriet.
Okay, one last question. Maybe we'll go with the most popular one, which is, what is your vision for world population in few hundred or thousands of years?
Like, what do I think? Do you think that question means what do I think the world population is going to be?
I think, yes, the world population, what it's going to be, and how is that going to impact agriculture, and how are we going to deal with that, as whether it grows or decreases, or whatever your vision for that might look like?
Yeah, it's another good question and a hard one to answer. I mean, you know, to one extent, the population for the next 100 years or so is pretty well locked in. So, you know, just because the people who are going to be around for the next 100 years or so are already born. So we get locked in for about that time. That doesn't bring us out 10,000 years. And there is so much that could happen on a 10,000 year time frame that it's hard to picture. I guess what I would say is, you know, we know that our impact on the planet is a combination of our population and our, you know, consumption patterns, maybe modified by technology. And when I look at those, I guess globally, we need to get a handle on both. And so when we start to get into this, like, is it population, is it consumption? It's like, well, depends where you live and who you are, with, you know, whether you're in one situation or the other, but ultimately it's really both. And we've got to get a handle, you know, on both of those, whether it's population through better education primarily seems to be the big driver of managing population, women's education especially, or, you know, in our part of the world, it really is a consumption issue. So how are we going to get a handle on that? How are we going to maybe, to go back to the question earlier, how do you take advantage of what COVID has done to many of us for our consumption patterns and really sort of get a handle on where we want that to be instead of just where it happens to be?
All right. Okay, I would certainly like to thank you again, Elena, for joining us today and for essentially kicking off our virtual meeting with your very engaging and talk, and also for the lively discussion we had after the talk. Also would like to thank John again for bringing everyone up to speed on what's happening with Global Water Futures. And then thanks everybody for attending. We're all excited that you've joined us, and we have very many more sessions and activities to come. And in fact, the slide here shows some highlights for today's program. So I'd like to thank everyone again and see you again soon. Bye.